When I was younger, I was always forced to read, and I would always choose picture books, so I don't really count the books I read when I was a kid. And then in school, we had to read like actual books, and I always hated them. And I actually didn't even read them most of the time. I would just look up the book summary on Spark Notes. But then I really started to get into improving myself, and I started watching YouTube videos on how to improve different things. There was one guy called Hamza, and he was talking about how to breathe properly. And I remember watching that whole video, being pretty excited because I realized I was breathing wrong my whole life, and I could fix it. And then at the end of the video, he said that he learned it all from a book. And I was so shocked because I hated reading. Reading was my worst enemy. But then this guy said that he learned all this stuff from a book. And the reason why I didn't like reading was because it was always forced upon me. I never saw the value until I realized that this guy learned stuff that improved his life and it improved my life from a book. And so I checked out that very book called The Oxygen Advantage, and that was my first book that I ever read on my own. And that book is basically explains how to breathe properly. And if I had to sum it up, you basically just breathe through your nose and breathe like slow and controlled. So like I'm pretty sure the perfect breath is 6 seconds in, 6 seconds out. And then once I finished reading that book, I wanted more. I was hooked. And so I was thinking, well, maybe if I just read books on things that I want to improve in my life at the time. And at the time, I knew I was addicted to my phone. And so I wanted to get rid of that. I wanted to figure out how to fix that. And so I went on online and I found a book called How to Break Up with Your Phone. And I don't even remember much from it. I don't even think that I got much value out of it because I didn't really take much action. But it definitely helped wire my brain to make better decisions in the future. So it was worthwhile reading at the time. And the third book that I read is called Above the Line. And I only read it because it was laying around in my house. And I think that it was pretty good. It had a good influence on me. What I remember from it was that you basically have to hold yourself to a higher standard than everyone else. You have to basically hold yourself above the line. And if I remember correctly, it's about like a football team and the coach is basically getting everyone to hold themselves above the line. Like there's a line and this is like the requirement, like this is the standard, but then everyone has to hold themselves above that standard. And then there were a few books that I didn't read completely. I only got them from the library because I wanted something to read and I didn't really know what to read. So the first one was called The Alter Ego Effect. And what I remember from that was essentially you have to create a new persona, a new identity for yourself when you're in a certain environment. For example, let's say you play soccer and you are too nice in real life. So let's say you're just the nice guy. The alter ego effect, you basically create a new ego, create a new identity for yourself when you step on that field and you become a menace. You become a warrior. That's basically what I learned from it. And I think it did help me a little bit, but I didn't read it fully. The fourth book that I read was called Unscripted by MJ DeMarco. And I had heard about this guy from all over the internet. And it was one of the most pivotal books that I had ever read in my entire life because all my life I kind of had this entrepreneurial mindset. I remember I used to go trade bags of chips in middle school for hot lunches because I didn't have any money to pay for my own, and I would sell candy. And then once I got into high school, I started looking into like an actual career option. And so I thought, okay, well, maybe if I learn how to program websites, I'll be able to build my own business on top of it. So I started to try to learn how to code. Basically, I was always entrepreneurial minded, and I never really wanted to go to college. I didn't really like school. I didn't like school other than talking to my friends. And then once I got to high school, I was told that I would have to go to college. And I live in a town where like 99% of the students go to college. So it wasn't like, are you going to college? It's you're going to college. And I just felt so kind of forced, but it was never forced upon me. It was just kind of like the identity of living in my community. And then Unscripted by MJ DeMarco basically laid out the entire foundation, the entire formula for entrepreneurship, and then also exposed the path that I'm going down. So essentially, he reveals 3 paths. There's the slow lane, the sidewalk, and the fast lane. I was headed down the slow lane, which is basically you go through high school, college, you get a job, work a 9 to 5 for the rest of life, slave for 40 years, and then you can finally retire. The sidewalk is you basically spend, and then you're in debt, and then you're working forever. And then the fast lane is you basically create your own business, and that's like the entrepreneurial route, and it is a much quicker path to financial freedom. And so I kind of had like the idea that I wanted to be an entrepreneur for a long time, but I didn't really know like what that was. I didn't really know anything about that. And then I read that book and I was like, okay, I'm not going to college. After I read that book, I decided I was not going to college. That was the first time I ever actually said it out loud because I was always so scared. And I was going to college, but I didn't want to until I read that book. So it changed my life. And the next book that I read, it was called The Millionaire Fastlane. And it's really similar to Unscripted. It's also written by MJ DeMarco. And I just read it because I liked that Unscripted book so much, and I wanted to get that other book and see what it was about. And I basically remember them both saying the same things. I learned the same things from it. And if I were to recommend one, it would be Unscripted because it was so pivotal for my mindset at the time. If I remember correctly, Unscripted really laid out a lot of the kind of stories and like the rat race side of things. And so when I started reading books, it was back in my junior year of high school. So it was 2022. And I started reading around September. And the last book that I read that year of 2022 was called Ultralearning. And the reason why I wanted to read this book was because I kind of had this intuition that in the future I was going to have to learn a lot of things because it makes sense. If you just got to learn things to be able to actually do things. And so I read that book because I just wanted to learn how to learn because school kind of failed me on that front. I never really got much value out of school from learning. In fact, I never really, actually, let's not get into that. But Ultralearning, I really was able to get a completely different perspective on learning. And it showed me that that's like a whole nother avenue to your life. And it showed me like the extremes that people go through with learning, like spending 10 plus hours every day locked in a room, just grinding out whatever they're working on and just becoming masters at their crafts. So that book definitely helped influence me a lot. And one of the other reasons why I wanted to read it was because at the time I really wanted to learn a language, or at least I had a intention to learn it in the future. And I also heard that in Ultralearning, they talked about how to learn a language very quickly. So it made sense that I wanted to read it. And it was definitely worth it to read. And the first book that I read in 2023 was called The China Study. And I remember I wanted to read it because at the time I knew that my diet was not that good. I had learned about how to breathe properly. I had learned about exercising and lifting weights just from my real life experience, but I didn't really know anything about diet. I didn't know how to eat healthy. All that I kind of knew was probably don't eat candy, probably don't eat cake. But that wasn't good enough for me. So I wanted to read a book. And there was this one book that my grandma read. My grandma was a dietitian. And she read this book called The China Study. And after she read that book, she became vegetarian. And she's been vegetarian ever since for like 14, 15 years, maybe even longer than that. I don't really know. And so that book kind of was on the back of my mind, but I never really pulled the trigger to actually read it until I saw someone else, another author that I read recommended that book. And so I read that book, The China Study, and it definitely helped me. I became vegan after that for 3 months, and it helped me learn about how to actually eat healthy. But here's the thing. It's interesting because I still don't really know much about diet. But that book gave me a different perspective because it basically compared people in like the city area of China to people in like the rural areas of China. And the people in the city, they were eating basically like a bunch of meats and like a bunch of processed garbage. And the people in the rural areas were eating just vegetables and grains and basically all just plants. And so what I interpreted from that book was don't eat meat at all. But I don't really know anything. I'm not a scientist. I'm not an expert on this. I eat meat now. I didn't eat meat after I read that book, but now my philosophy is as long as it's a whole food. And that book helped give me that perspective because it basically compared people who were in a more primitive culture than the people who were in a city area. And that's a perspective that I take with me, and it helped a lot. But I would not read it again because I don't know. And then the second book that I read in 2023 was called The Tools. And this book was really the first book that opened me up to a complete unknown region in my self-improvement and in my life in general. And it's just everything going on in your mind, because The Tools basically lays out a lot of like the psychology and a lot of different mental tools to use throughout your days. And I don't really remember the tools that much, but what I got from that book was that it's very important, your mental. And so that basically planted a seed deep in my mind that started to sprout. And we'll get to how that came to be a little bit later in the video. But my mom actually got me that book because her boss really liked it. And so my mom read it and then really liked it and then bought it for all of my family members. And so I'm actually pretty glad that I read that book. And the next book that I read is called Breath, the New Science of a Lost Art. And the reason why I wanted to read this was because Oxygen Advantage was the first book that I read. It was all about breathing. And I was really interested in that. And I heard that Breath, the New Science of a Lost Art gave a different perspective and attacked it from a different angle. And it also talked about your jaw and your teeth and different things. I don't really remember much from it, but what I got out of it is breathe through your nose also, and then chew a lot. Chewing is good. Chew hard foods and mute, like basically have good tongue posture. And so that book definitely helped me. And a lot of these like health books, like the breathing books, the diet books, and then later on in the video, sleep books, all of these books I'm really glad I read, but I probably wouldn't read them again. But the reason why I'm glad I read them was because it basically wired my mind to automatically make better decisions for myself. And it gave me the perspective to know how to make better decisions in my health. So that's why I'm glad I read these books. And if I were starting from ground zero and I hadn't read any of these books, I definitely would read these books. And the next book that I read is called The Unplugged Alpha. And the reason why I wanted to read that book was because I wanted to get a girlfriend, and I heard online that book was good. Now, once I actually read it, I realized that I should actually just focus on myself and then eventually focus on getting a girlfriend. And so it really positively impacted me on, instead of just chasing girls, just focus on growing myself. And also there's one thing that I got out of that book that completely changed the game for me, and it was just one sentence. There was one sentence in that book that said the simplest way to build your discipline is to take cold showers. And ever since then, I've only taken cold showers. And then after I read The Unplugged Alpha, I read a book called The Appearance of Power, and I read it because he recommended it in The Unplugged Alpha. And what I got out of it is that there is actually a optimal color combination to wear depending on like different factors of your physique, like your skin color, your eye color, and then your hair color. And basically it was too complicated for me. I didn't really care too much to spend the time to figure all that stuff out. So I just do contrasting colors. The next book that I read is called Why We Sleep. And this was me just wanting to learn everything about health, sleep, diet, breathing, all of that stuff I wanted to learn. And this book really helped me a lot because it gave me the perspective and the knowledge that your sleep is literally the most important aspect of your health. There's a common idea that sleep is just one pillar to your health, like sleep, exercise, diet, water, whatever. These are all just pillars. But what that book taught me was that in reality, it's more like sleep is the foundation, like literally the most important thing. If that crumbles, everything else goes bad. And then everything else builds on top of that. So sleep, that book really helped me. And I don't even remember it helping much on the actual tactics, like what you should actually do to get good sleep. But it gave me the complete identity shift to realize that, sleep, it really is the most important thing. So I just got to really focus on it. And then after I read that book, I really started searching on how to actually improve your sleep. And that's when I got like blackout curtains. That's when I started going to bed at the same time, waking up at the same time, even on the weekends. That's when I really started to really lock in on my sleep. The next two books that I read were pretty good, but I never finished them just because I got bored and I moved on. The first one was called Are You Dreaming? And the reason why I wanted to read that book was because I wanted to get into lucid dreaming, which is basically like you becoming awake and aware that you're dreaming. And you basically get to control the dream. And I really liked that concept. And in fact, I actually did lucid dream a couple times before that in the past on purpose. And I've gone through phases of having a desire to lucid dream. And I've had a few lucid dreams in my life, but I lost interest in the book and I didn't really care that much anymore. But I definitely thought that it was a good book. And the reason why I chose that one was because I heard that that was the best book on lucid dreaming on the market. And so that's why I chose it, but I never finished it. And then the second book that I read that I didn't finish was called The 48 Laws of Power. And I don't remember why I chose to read that book, but I heard that it was really good. And so I read it, and it was pretty good. It gave me a lot of perspectives, and it helped me kind of navigate the waters of like the social dynamics. And it helped a lot with staying kind of socially safe. But I just got bored. I'm going to be honest. I got bored of the book because it's a really long read. It's like pretty hard to read. But I definitely think that it was a good book. In fact, just a couple months ago, I pulled it back out and I read a little bit of it, but I got bored again. The next book that I read was called How to Win Friends and Influence Others. And this book was just like the number one book on social skills. So I thought I would read it. And I heard that is like the number one self-improvement book. If you're on self-improvement, you got to read that book. And I definitely think that it helped me. It really helped me understand that you should always try and use people's names and you should always smile and always like greet people. And I remember very quickly after reading that book, I was a lot more friendly with people. And I would always just say hi to people a lot more often, a lot more enthusiastically. And so it definitely helped me a lot. And it's a lot more fun to be friendly to people. And this is where we get into the interesting part, because this next book I started, it's called Reality Transurfing. And earlier in the video, I mentioned how this book called The Tools planted a seed in my mind that I should focus on the thoughts. And that seed sprouted, and I had a strong desire to read a book on thoughts, just like The Tools. And so I looked up like book on mind or book on thoughts. And I looked at the options. It was all garbage until a couple weeks later, I saw a YouTube short. It was a guy interviewing another dude named Iman Gaji. And basically he asked, what kind of books are you reading now? And Iman Gaji said, yeah, I'm reading a book called Reality Transurfing. And so I was thinking, oh, that's kind of a weird book. The cover looked weird. The title looked weird, but I was intrigued. So I looked it up, and on Amazon, it was like $80. And I was like, no way. And I looked at the page count. It was like 750 pages. And I was thinking, oh my goodness, if this book is the biggest book I've ever seen in my life, and Iman Gaji read it, he's like a multimillionaire, there are definitely secrets in this book that's going to make me a lot of money. And so right then and there, I decided to click purchase, and I bought that book. And I read up until chapter 10, which was maybe like 200, 300 pages in. And I said that I got bored, but in reality it was something different, and we'll get to that a little bit later in the video. And since I got bored of reality transurfing, the next book that I read was called Estrogeneration. And this book really helped a lot with giving me another perspective on health and making better choices. But I'll say that it really destroyed a lot of my mental health, because I was learning that all of these chemicals in my environment were killing me and poisoning me, but I couldn't do anything about it because I didn't have any money to buy like the actual organic products, to buy the real things. And so it was like this really long, torturous period where I was just, every day I was using products that I knew was really bad for me. And it was just going so far against my identity. And it was a very bad, dark period of my life, I'll be honest. And I hated it. Until I realized that I've just got to let it go because I don't have any money. So I just got to just deal with it now. And then in the future, I'll be able to buy the actual good products that are not bad for me. But earlier I talked about Unscripted and how that book really helped me go all into entrepreneurship. But truth is, I wasn't really into entrepreneurship. I was just kind of learning how to code, and I wasn't really like looking into business yet. But this book was one of the books that really caused me to move forward, because I knew that I needed money to buy all the organic products. And so I was like, okay, well, I just got to go into entrepreneurship. And so around this time, I was writing in my journal, like, that's the next phase in my life, entrepreneurship. But I'm definitely glad I read that book, and I would recommend it. Just be careful not to go down that dark path like I did if you can't afford all the more expensive but health positive products. The next book that I partially read was called Meditations. And basically what this book is, it's like a Roman emperor called Marcus Aurelius. He had a journal, and he would just write all of these like very philosophical thoughts, like everything that he was thinking at the time in his journal. And he had no intention to publish it. But then someone found all of the journals and then published it into a book, and it just became this like really powerful book. It's like a very thought-provoking book. And I just remember reading it, and I didn't really understand it. And I just thought that, oh, well, I don't have the wisdom to understand this yet. Maybe I'll read it later on in my life when I have a lot more wisdom to understand it. But I definitely think it is a good book because I heard very good things from it. And in fact, the other month, I actually read a few paragraphs in it, and I definitely thought that it was good. And the next book that I read is called The Way of the Superior Man. And this book helped so much because it explained a concept called purpose. And it basically means that everyone has their own unique purpose in life, the reason why they live, and that you should follow it and pursue it. And it explained how to find your purpose and why you should actually go for it. And it explained to actually do it. And it also explained a lot of different concepts that were very foreign to me, and it really helped a lot. And we're back to reality transurfing. Earlier, I talked about how I got bored of reality transurfing. In reality, I did not get bored. I actually stopped because I couldn't handle it. It was too powerful. Because at that time, I was in this really lonely period where I was reading a lot of books, and I was talking about it with my friends, and no one was really interested in all the stuff I was learning. And so I kind of started to close myself off, and I didn't really have anyone to talk to about the books I was reading. And then I read Transurfing, and this book was so powerful. It was such a hard pill to swallow, and I didn't have anyone to talk to. I felt like I was going down this path all alone, and it was really hard to go through. And so that's why I stopped reading that book originally. And then I met a friend who was going down a similar path to I was. And then one day he asked to see my reading list, and he saw this book called Reality Transurfing, and he was curious. And I said, nah, don't read that. It's an advanced book to read in the future. But then the next day, he asked to see my reading list again, and he was really curious about that book, Reality Transurfing. And I was like, you know what? Read it. It's the best book I've ever read in my life. In fact, I'm going to pick it up and read it right now again. And so for the next 2 months, I read that book for the first time all the way through, and it completely changed my life. It explained a lot of things that I needed to know that set the foundation for my future with how to think properly and how to actually manage your way in life. The other day, I explained it just on a whim, and I said, that book teaches you how to exist. And then around this time, this was when I really decided to just pull the trigger and go all in to entrepreneurship. So I reread the book called The Millionaire Fastlane to get my mind back on that wavelength. And then after that, I read a book called .com Secrets. And that book gave me such a great perspective because I was looking into different business models and trying to figure out what I should do. And I wasn't really thinking in the correct formula. And then .com Secrets explained this whole concept of websites and just business in general. It gave me the first glimpse of what business is. And so that book was really revolutionary for me. And after that, I knew that the next step was to file an LLC. So this next book that I read was called LLC's Beginner's Guide. And I gotta say, it was not that good. It was just that book. I only got that because I was terrified. That was the scariest thing I'd ever done in my life, to start a business. I'm not even gonna lie. I was literally shaking. I had to spend an entire week doing fear-setting exercises to actually pull the trigger and file my business. Not because it cost money, but because this was like the next phase of my life that was so terrifying to me. And so I needed a book to cope with that, and I needed to like get the perspective. And so that book I only read just because I was afraid. So the book called The 4-Hour Workweek gave me such a great extra perspective from the book that I read earlier was called Unscripted. Unscripted basically explained to go down the path, to go down the fast lane, to actually go into entrepreneurship. But the 4-Hour Workweek explained another side of the coin, how people are wasting all their time doing dumb stuff that doesn't need to be done, when in reality you could actually just spend a few hours a week working. And I gotta say, there was a bad thing that I got out of it, which was that I actually did that. I actually spent like an hour a week working, or an hour a day working for a long time, when in reality I needed to be working a lot more. So that was a negative thing that I got out of it. But I definitely learned a lot of good stuff, like the Pareto principle, like the 80-20 rule. So the next book I read was called Expert Secrets. And this was the second book in the trilogy. So the first book was DotCom Secrets, which I explained earlier. And then the second book was Expert Secrets. DotCom Secrets explains like the website structure and like how to actually structure your business. Expert Secrets explains how to actually speak, how to tell stories. It's basically what I'm doing right now. That's what Expert Secrets teaches. And that was another super good book for me, pivotal in my journey, because I was still looking for a business model. Around this time, I was looking into acne, and I actually filed my business. I filed an LLC for acne. Like that was what my business was going to be in. And I was not passionate about that at all. And then I read Expert Secrets, and it was explaining, it basically told me to start a show, to start a podcast. And I was like, okay, well, I'm going to start a podcast. I didn't know what I wanted to talk about, so I just started talking about what I was interested in, which was self-improvement. And I started a podcast called Ascend Momentum. And from that point on until maybe like 100 days, I posted every day. I spoke every day. I practiced every day. And I learned so much. But that book really helped with my storytelling. It gave me another perspective on that. And it got me in the game. It actually got me to start this whole journey. And the next book was called Traffic Secrets. That was the third book in the trilogy. And it basically explained how to actually get people into your business. So now that you've read DotCom Secrets, you have the structure of your business. And now that you read Expert Secrets, you actually know how to actually talk to people and what to do, what to say, how to say it. And then you read Traffic Secrets, and that teaches how to actually get people through the door, how to actually find people and bring them in. And I'm explaining all of these business books and entrepreneur books. I've made $0 online. So do not listen to anything I have to say. I am not credible. I'm just explaining kind of what I learned up to this point. But I will say most of these books were recommended by very successful people. And then the next book I read was called The E-Myth Revisited. And that gave me another good perspective on business and how to actually go about it properly. Now, around this time, I was starting to reread two books, Expert Secrets and Reality Transurfing. And I finished rereading all of Reality Transurfing for the second time through. And around this time, I also read a book called The Alchemist. And this is a story about a young boy chasing after his dream. And I really liked it. The reason why I read it was because my dad was obsessed with it. It's like his favorite book, and he's read it many times in the past. And so he recommended it to me. And then I also heard someone else, another author that I've read before, and other YouTubers talk about it. And that's why I read it. And there was another book that I read, and it's not a book, it's more of like a document, which is called The Analysis and Assessment of the Gateway Process. And the reason why I started reading this was because in a different book that I will mention later in the video called Dancing After the Music Stops, he mentioned this declassified CIA document. And it's basically talks about like meditation and consciousness. And so I read that. It was pretty interesting. And it sent me down this whole journey of meditation. And then after that, I became obsessed with everything related to this gateway experience. And I started actually doing the gateway experience, and I was reading everything. And there was one book in particular, it's a very long PDF called 7 Resonant Colors. And I read the whole thing. It's like 100+ pages. Very interesting. And so around this time, I went to a business conference in Florida with my friend, and it was Russell Brunson's business conference, ClickFunnels. The author of all the 3 books that I mentioned earlier, DotCom Secrets, Expert Secrets, and Traffic Secrets. And so he also released this next book, which was kind of like a packet called The Linchpin. And it was another book on how to structure your business. And it was very interesting. It gave me another perspective on business. And I only read that packet because he was going to be talking about it pretty much the whole event. And so I wanted to have that understanding. And so when we went to that conference, there was a bunch of books that we got. A bunch of different speakers gave all their books. And one speaker in particular really blew me away. His name was Dr. Benjamin Hardy. And he was just amazing. And I just remember being so amazed at what he was saying. And he was definitely one of my favorite speakers in that entire conference. And he gave us his book. And I literally started reading it on the plane. And I definitely think that was a very good book. It basically explains how a lot of the things we do to improve are not really improving us as much as it could. There's like a 10x task, and then there's a 2x task. The 2x task is, it's going to improve us, but it's not really going to help us leap forward and make those giant leaps. And I'm really glad I read it, because there was a lot of 2x things that I was doing, and it helped clear a lot of things out. The next book was called Create, Don't Capture. And I actually got that book pre-released. So he didn't actually publish it, and it was from another one of the speakers. And that book was all about content creation. And that was exactly what I needed, because once we went to that conference, that's when I started really posting real videos on my YouTube channel instead of just like podcast episodes. That's when I started doing TikToks and YouTube shorts. And so that Create, Don't Capture book helped give me another perspective. And this next book I mentioned earlier, called Dancing After the Music Stops. And this was the book. It's just a book on like spirituality. And I gotta say, this book tore me apart when I read it, because I was still in school. And I was reading about how school is just destroying you. School is really bad for you. And I was reading about how this guy is going on so many adventures in life, and he's living life to the fullest. And I was stuck in school. And it was so bad for me. It caused me to get so angry. I genuinely wanted to drop out. But that book was so good. Like that, do not take this as a bad trying to push you away from it. I definitely recommend that book. It's really good. And this next book was called Die Wise. I did not finish reading it because I didn't really understand it. I figured that I didn't have enough wisdom to understand it. And I didn't really want to kind of put in the energy, because it wasn't really going to help me on my actual business. But it was a book that was on the author of Dancing After the Music Stops reading list. He has an entire website called The Most Beautiful World, and it's a reading list called The Ultimate Reading List for Human Beings. And Die Wise was number 1. And the reason why I was so interested in this reading list was because it was like a blog post. And he had like a bunch of paragraphs before he listed the reading list. And he said to read Reality Transurfing first. And so I basically interpreted that as Reality Transurfing is the foundation to the ultimate reading list to human beings. So that basically means that all of these other books are amazing. And so that's why I wanted to get into these books, but my interest shifted and I chose not to read Die Wise. And so around this time, I attempted to reread Reality Transurfing for a third time, but I didn't finish it. And the next book I read was called Rework. I finished that book in like 2 days. It was a very quick read. And this was one of the books that I bought many months before that, when I was deciding to go all into entrepreneurship. Because when I decided to go all into entrepreneurship, I went online and looked up best books on entrepreneurship, and I bought 8 books, and I spent like $200, and that was my symbolizing that I was going all in. And Rework was one of them, but it was pretty good, and it gave me a lot of different insights. It was basically like rapid fire tips. So the next 2 books I read, one of them is called 7 Steps to Turn Your Instagram into a Cash Machine. And this like a little packet. I got it from the business conference that I went to, and it was all right. The next book that I read was called Podcast Launch. And this was when I realized that I sucked. I sucked at podcasting. And so I bought a few books. I wanted to start reading books on podcasting. And this was called Podcast Launch. And I had heard about John Lee Dumas before from Russell Brunson, the author of the 3 books, DotCom Secrets, Expert Secrets, and Traffic Secrets. And that's when I read that book. But it didn't really help me much because it was a lot of like basic things that I had already done. And this next book was called So You Want to Start a Podcast. And I gotta say, that was a very good book. It definitely helped a lot with my podcast. And I don't really remember much about how it helped me, but it definitely helped me with my podcast. And the reason why I chose that book was because I heard that was like the #1 book on podcasting. And I gotta agree, it was pretty good. I mean, I haven't read the other books, but that book was really good. And this next book was called The Law of Success in 16 Lessons. And the reason why I read it was because back at that business conference that I was at, Russell Brunson told a story about how this guy named Napoleon Hill, he spent 25 years studying like the most successful people in the world, like Henry Ford, Andrew Carnegie, like all of the very elite level successful people. And then eventually he started writing books, and he wrote a book called The Law of Success in 16 Lessons. And this book was so powerful. He released it, and the most powerful man in the world, Henry Ford, told Napoleon Hill to take it down because it was too powerful. He didn't want it in the hands of the public. And so he took it away and he cut it down, cut out a lot of like the good stuff, and then released this new book. And that book was also too powerful. Henry Ford said, nope, take it out. And so he took it out and he cut it down even more. And that's where he got Think and Grow Rich, which became the #1 bestseller in the world, sold like 14 million copies, worldwide phenomenon, like one of the most famous self-improvement books in the world. And so when I heard that story, I was thinking, man, Think and Grow Rich, that's like a crazy good book. But Law of Success, that is so, like, I gotta get that book. So I read that book, and it laid out all of the character traits that you need to have in order to have success. So it was definitely helpful. In fact, I just finished rereading it the other month. So the next book is called Can't Hurt Me, and this was the last book I read in 2023. It was about a guy named David Goggins and his life story about how he does crazy difficult things. And it is such a good book. I definitely recommend it. It gave me such a good perspective, gave me so many more stories to motivate and just keep on getting after it. And the first book that I read in 2024, which was called Deep Work. And I gotta be honest, it did not really help me that much because I had already done all of the changes that he described in that book. But I'm glad I read it because there were a few different tactics and strategies that he explained that I definitely started to use after that. But I didn't think that it was as good as I thought it was going to be, simply because I already made like a lot of the changes that were like the most powerful changes that he recommended. And the next book that I read was called Discipline is Destiny. And this book was so good. It gave so many different aspects of discipline and explained discipline all throughout. And it gave me so many things to do. I started doing the dishes after that, and I noticed that my initiative, my drive just skyrocketed. Life feels like a game. Like literally, I feel like a video game character sometimes. Not all the time, but I have become so much more free because I took action on a lot of the stuff that he talked about in that book. Even though I was kind of already headed toward that path, it definitely sped it up. So this next book is called The Power of Personal Storytelling. It was a book on storytelling. And I got to say, that book definitely caused the most action out of me because I told myself I was going to take action on every single thing. And pretty much all of these stories that I have told in this video, I could have only told because I read that book and took action on a lot of the stuff. These stories would have been lost to my memory if I didn't read that book and take action. So it was definitely very valuable and really helpful. This next book was a quick read. I read it in like 4 hours one morning, and it's called Observation, Every Man His University. And I read it because Napoleon Hill in The Law of Success in 16 Lessons talked about how that book was very good and how you should read it. So I read it, and it was a pretty old book, so it was kind of hard to understand at times. But the best thing that I learned from it was that you should just observe. Literally just observe and learn. But it was all right. It's probably one of those books where I didn't really spend enough time and I don't really have enough wisdom to really appreciate how powerful it is. The next book was called Unleash the Power of Storytelling, and it was just another storytelling book. But it gave me some more tips to work on for my storytelling. For example, keeping it simple. And then I reread Expert Secrets for the second time. And then after that, I read a book called The 100, and it was the ranking of the 100 most influential people in all of history. And the reason why I wanted to read that book was because I was looking into reading biographies. I wanted to start reading biographies. And so I figured if I would get this book of the 100 most influential people, I would be able to pick one of the influential people that I wanted to read about. And I did not end up doing that, but it told me a lot of different stories about all these different 100 people, and there was a lot of people I never even heard about, and it gave me a more fuller perspective of the world. And so I'm glad I read it. This next book was called Influencer, and this was one of the books that I did not spend enough time with, and it's something I should definitely spend a lot more time on. It basically explained all of how to influence people, how to get people to do things, how to get people to change their behaviors. And it was not just beneficial for like how to get people to change their behaviors, but it's also beneficial for my own growth. There was a lot of things in there that they confirmed that was beneficial that I was already doing. For example, changing my environment is a very powerful way to change your behaviors. And so it helped me understand why I was successful in my own development. But overall, pretty good book. Now, there's one book that I got. It's called 30 Days, and it's basically a compilation of 30 different successful entrepreneurs' paths or plan that they would take if they had to start from $0, and they'd have to rebuild their empire again in 30 days. And it's a pretty good book. I didn't read the whole thing. I've only read a few people inside of it. And the next book I actually have down here with me. It's called Ask by Ryan Levesque. And this book I read because I wanted to have a business that would be guaranteed success. And the way to do that is to basically ask the customer what it is they want. And so if you go onto my YouTube channel, you'll see the link of 1%dad.com. That is me basically taking action on the stuff that they talk about in Ask. And to be honest, I did not read that whole book. The first half of the book was basically his life story. And that was so good. Like, it was actually such a good book because he told so many different stories about how much work he puts in. And I gotta say, after I read that book, I started to put in a lot more work because I had this extra perspective. But basically, if I had to sum up that book, all you have to do is ask, what's the single most difficult thing you experience in regards to this problem? And after you do that, you basically have to ask like hundreds of people and then extrapolate a solution from there. And there's a little bit more to it, but that's it. After that, I reread The Way of the Spirit Man and Reality Transurfing for this third time. And then I read this book called Grinding It Out. This book is the autobiography of Ray Kroc, and it's like the creating of McDonald's. Ray Kroc was the CEO and the founder and former CEO of McDonald's. And I bought that book a long time ago. It was just sitting in my closet and then up in the attic for a long time, and then I finally read it, and it was really good. It was just an autobiography and told a lot of different stories and gave me another good perspective on you just got to grind it out. You just have to put in a lot of work. And I'm glad I read it because similar to Ask, around the time I was really only putting in like 3 hours of work every day. And then Ask and Grinding It Out helped me get more perspective to put in more work. So the next book that I read is called The YouTube Formula. And I had a desire to read a book on YouTube for a long time, but none of the ones that I found online really caught my eye. And then I was in this YouTube growth community, and some dude randomly DM'd me and asked me if I had tried the YouTube Formula by Daryl Eves. And I had never heard Daryl Eves before. I'd never heard of the YouTube Formula. And I looked it up, and I heard that Daryl Eves was the number one YouTube consultant in the world. Mr. Beast, the most successful YouTuber in the world, said that no one knows YouTube as much as Daryl does. Mr. Beast still talks to Daryl Eves about YouTube. And so after I heard that, I went to Daryl Eves' website and bought the book. And it was pretty good. And it helped a lot with getting me to understand more things about YouTube. And now I fear that since I'm not successful on YouTube yet, you're probably going to think, oh, that book sucks. But just give it time. Quick note, I know that this video is probably not going to do well. And if it does, well, that just proves that I don't know what I'm doing. I have no idea how to do YouTube. But if it doesn't, well, it also proves that I have no idea what I'm doing. I do not know how to be a YouTuber. But I just wanted to make this video because I've always found reading lists very helpful from the YouTubers that I would watch, and also from just people in general. I always like reading lists, so that's why I wanted to make this reading list. And then after that, I reread a book called The Law of Success in 16 Lessons for the second time. And then in that second read of Law of Success in 16 Lessons, Napoleon Hill said that he talked about this guy called Emmerson all the time, and he mentioned him throughout the book. And then one of the action steps in the book towards the end was basically to read Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay on compensation. And so I bought a book which had all of Ralph Waldo Emerson's essays in it, and I just read Compensation. And it's a pretty quick read. It took me maybe a few hours. And it was very good. Compensation is basically, if you're putting in a lot of work for free and you do that for an extended period of time, eventually you're going to get outsized returns and you're going to get compensated well. And the next book I read is called Ego is the Enemy. And the reason why I started reading this was because I had this kind of intuition or this feeling for a long time, this desire for a long time to start learning about the ego. And then eventually I said something dumb that I shouldn't have in my podcast episode. And right after that, I was like, all right, I'm getting into ego. And it's because I had too big of an ego, and I still have too big of an ego. But this book helped a lot with whittling it down and giving me more perspective and giving me more knowledge so that I actually know what I'm dealing with. But basically, Ego is the Enemy talks about the 3 stages, 3 different phases that we are always in. You're either in the aspiring stage where you're striving towards success and you have to keep your ego at bay, or you are in the successful stage where you are successful and you have to keep your ego at bay, or you're in the failure stage and you failed and you have to keep your ego in bay. Overall, great book. The next book is called Save the Cat, and it's a pretty quick read. It was a book on screenwriting, and it's basically just like how to write a movie. And the reason why I wanted to read that was because I wanted to learn about storytelling structure for my YouTube videos. And then after that, I read a book called The Hero with 1,000 Faces. And this book, I just finished reading, and it is very good. It basically explains how all mythologies, all fairy tales, pretty much every single story is the same story, and how they all have like the similar aspects, give or take different pieces, but it's all just like the same hero, like the hero with 1,000 faces. And I still don't really understand it very well, but I also really liked reading it because it gave a lot of different stories from different religions that I really want to look into and learn about. For example, Hinduism and Buddhism, and then also gave a lot of different stories on like Christianity and different saints, and it was an awesome book. But that was the last book that I have read so far. And the next book I'm going to read is called Prometheus' Rising. And it's because I heard there's this guy called Deja Ru 22. I don't know who he is. My friend just sent me one of his tweets one time. And he said, this is his ultimate reading list or something. It's like 6 books. And one of the books was Reality Transurfing. So I figured that the rest of the books were going to be pretty good. And so one of them is called Prometheus' Rising. And that book is what I'm reading next. And his tweet basically said, if you read all 6 or 7 of these books, you're going to run laps on everyone. And that is it. That's the rest. That is my whole entire reading list up until this point. And just by the way, in the book that I read called Save the Cat, the first scene is an opening image. It also has a contrasting point of the final image, the closing image. And the opening image shows the character as before, the hero as before, and the final image shows the hero as after. And the last scene of the movie is supposed to show all of the growth. And so my opening image of this YouTube video was me saying that I basically hated reading. And now the closing image is me saying, I love reading.